Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The door to Crownstone Bank opened with a soft chime as the mid-morning sun spilled into the lobby. Darius Morgan stepped inside, his polished Oxfords making confident yet quiet clicks against the marble floor. The scent of aged leather, fresh coffee, and polished wood filled the air. The grandeur of the bank's interior was unmistakable. High vaulted ceilings adorned with intricate moldings, crystal chandeliers that shimmered in the light, and plush, upholstered chairs arranged neatly in waiting areas, all radiated affluence and exclusivity. Darius, in a tailored navy suit that perfectly complemented his broad shoulders and tall frame, carried himself with a dignified air. His tie, a subtle burgundy hue, was secured with a gold pin, and his cufflinks bore a discreet but elegant emblem. He exuded quiet authority, though his calm expression gave little away. In his hand, he held a check that could command attention anywhere, even in a bank like this. The atmosphere in the bank was subdued but efficient. Patrons, many of whom were dressed in business attire, whispered conversations with tellers or sat in focused silence filling out forms. A row of tellers operated behind their counters with robotic precision, their movements quick and practiced. Darius scanned the room briefly, his gaze pausing momentarily on a plaque that listed the names of the bank's board of directors. He moved toward the line of customers, his steps unhurried. The line was longer than he had anticipated, but he didn't mind. Darius had always believed patience was a virtue, one that often revealed more than haste ever could. As he waited, he studied the people around him, business professionals, retirees, and a young woman holding a child. Each of them seemed focused on their tasks, their expressions ranging from stressed to serene. As the minutes ticked by, Darius's attention shifted to the bank employees. The tellers were efficient, though a few looked weary from the constant stream of customers. A middle-aged woman in a crisp uniform managed the front desk, her face set in a permanent smile that wavered slightly under the weight of a tense interaction with a frustrated patron. Finally, the line moved, and Darius stepped forward. He approached the counter where a young teller, no older than her mid-20s, greeted him with a professional smile. Her name tag read Emily. "Good morning, sir," Emily said, her voice cheerful. "How can I assist you today?" Darius offered a polite smile in return and handed her the check. The moment her eyes scanned the amount, her professional demeanor faltered. Her eyebrows arched slightly, and she cast a quick glance at him, as if to confirm the man before her matched the number on the paper. "One moment, sir," she said, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. She turned to her computer, typing quickly while frequently glancing at the check. Darius waited without comment, his gaze wandering across the room. Behind Emily, a man in a gray suit stood near the teller stations. He was older, his posture rigid, and his face bore a faint scowl. His name tag identified him as Robert Peterson, manager. Robert seemed to have been observing the interaction from the moment Darius stepped forward. "Is everything all right?" Darius asked, his tone calm but deliberate. Emily hesitated. "I'll just need to get approval from our manager for this amount, sir. Please bear with me for a moment." Darius nodded, stepping slightly aside to allow the teller to confer with her superior. As Emily approached Robert with the check, Darius noticed the manager's demeanor shift. Robert's lips tightened as he glanced at the paper, and his eyes narrowed. A quiet conversation ensued, with Robert shaking his head slightly and gesturing toward Darius with a subtle motion that did not go unnoticed. A few moments later, Robert approached, his expression guarded. He stopped just short of the counter, addressing Darius with an air of authority. "Good morning, sir," Robert said, his tone polite but firm. "I'm the branch manager here. I understand you presented this check for cashing?" Darius met his gaze evenly. "That's correct." Robert scrutinized the check again, his brow furrowed. "This is quite a large amount. May I ask where you obtained it?" The question hung in the air, its insinuation clear. Several nearby customers glanced in their direction, their curiosity piqued by the unusual exchange. Darius's expression remained neutral, though his sharp eyes didn't miss the subtle shift in the atmosphere. "I believe the bank's policies allow for discretion in such matters," Darius replied smoothly. "The check is valid, and all the necessary details are in order." Robert's frown deepened. "We have to ensure due diligence for transactions of this nature, sir. I'll need additional identification and perhaps some documentation to verify the origin of these funds." Darius sighed inwardly, recognizing the familiar undertones in Robert's approach. He reached into his inner pocket and produced his identification, sliding it across the counter with deliberate precision. Robert inspected the ID carefully, his face a mask of skepticism. As he handed it back, his words carried a thinly veiled condescension. "This will take some time to process. Please have a seat while we conduct the necessary checks." Darius inclined his head slightly. "Take your time." He stepped away from the counter, his calm demeanor unshaken. Choosing a chair in the corner of the room, he sat with measured grace, placing his briefcase neatly beside him. The room buzzed faintly with activity, but Darius remained a still figure amidst the motion. As he waited, he noticed Robert retreating to his office, where a heated discussion seemed to be taking place over the phone. Darius's gaze shifted toward a group of employees who whispered amongst themselves, occasionally glancing in his direction. The subtle undercurrents of judgment and curiosity were unmistakable. Darius leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. His thoughts drifted to the irony of the situation. He had walked into the bank expecting efficiency, but instead, he was met with suspicion. The manager's behavior was all too familiar, an assumption wrapped in professionalism, a veneer that barely concealed its bias. He smiled faintly to himself, a quiet resolve settling in his chest. What Robert didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this interaction was about to take a turn no one in the room could have anticipated. This was just the beginning. Darius sat in the corner of the lobby, his sharp eyes catching every detail of the scene around him. The room pulsed with quiet activity, tellers assisting customers, the occasional ring of a phone, and the muted shuffle of papers. Despite the apparent efficiency, he could feel the weight of the stares. It wasn't blatant, but the subtle glances from the staff and even a few customers were unmistakable. Their curiosity, or perhaps suspicion, lingered in the air, brushing against his calm demeanor. From his vantage point, Darius had a clear view of Robert Peterson's office. Through the glass walls, the manager paced back and forth, phone pressed tightly to his ear. His animated gestures betrayed the gravity of the conversation. Every now and then, Robert's gaze flicked toward Darius, his expression unreadable but tense. It was clear the situation had unsettled him, though whether it was the amount on the check or something else entirely, Darius could only guess. He wasn't in a hurry. Years of navigating situations far more intense than this had taught him the value of composure. Darius had built his career, and his life, on a foundation of resilience and patience. Whatever Robert was trying to prove, Darius was content to let him have his moment. He leaned back in the chair, allowing his thoughts to drift momentarily to the journey that had brought him here. The Crownstone Bank was no ordinary financial institution. It was a symbol of old money, a cornerstone of the community's elite. Founded decades ago, it had weathered economic storms and emerged as a fortress of wealth and exclusivity. Darius knew this better than anyone. After all, Crownstone's history was woven into his own in ways that no one in this room could possibly imagine. He glanced at his watch. 20 minutes had passed since Robert had disappeared into his office, and still, there was no resolution. A few other customers had come and gone, their transactions completed with the efficiency one would expect from an institution of this caliber. Yet here he was, waiting for verification. The soft hum of murmurs pulled his attention. 2 employees near the teller counters were engaged in a whispered conversation, their eyes darting toward him every few seconds. One of them, a young man with a nervous energy, seemed particularly intent on studying Darius. The other, an older woman with a more composed demeanor, appeared to be trying to calm him. Darius's lips curved into a faint smile. He'd seen this before, the quiet whispers, the sideways glances, the assumptions. It was almost predictable. Still, he let it play out, knowing that time often revealed more than words ever could. Finally, the door to Robert's office opened. The manager stepped out, his face a mask of strained professionalism. In his hand, he held the check, now folded neatly in half. He walked toward Darius, his steps deliberate, his gaze fixed. "Mr. Morgan," Robert said, his tone carefully measured. "Thank you for your patience. I've consulted with our team, and unfortunately, there are some irregularities with this transaction that require further investigation." Darius raised an eyebrow, his expression betraying no emotion. "Irregularities," he repeated, his voice calm but firm. Robert hesitated, his grip on the check tightening slightly. "Yes. The amount is unusually large, and given the circumstances, we'll need additional time to verify its authenticity. I'm afraid we won't be able to process it today." The words hung in the air, a thinly veiled refusal that carried an undertone Darius couldn't ignore. The room seemed to grow quieter, the soft murmurs fading as the tension between the two men became palpable. A few customers looked up from their paperwork, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Darius leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto Robert's. "I see. And what specific concerns do you have about its authenticity?" "The check was issued by a reputable institution, and all the necessary details are in order." Robert's composure wavered, but only slightly. "It's standard protocol for transactions of this magnitude," he said, his tone clipped. "We have a responsibility to ensure the legitimacy of all funds processed through our bank." Darius studied him for a long moment, the weight of his scrutiny making Robert shift uncomfortably. Finally, Darius spoke, his voice low but resolute. "Your responsibility is to your customers, Mr. Peterson, not to assumptions." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that seemed to ripple through the room. Robert's jaw tightened, his discomfort now plainly visible. Before he could respond, Darius stood, his movements deliberate and controlled. The room seemed to hold its breath as he adjusted his suit jacket and reached for his briefcase. "If you cannot complete this transaction," Darius said, his voice steady, "I'll take my business elsewhere." Robert opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, the soft chime of the bank's front door interrupted him. Everyone turned as an older man in a charcoal gray suit entered the room. His presence was commanding, his silver hair and confident stride exuding authority. Several employees straightened at the sight of him, their expressions shifting to ones of respect and deference. The man's eyes swept the room before landing on Darius. A smile broke across his face as he approached, his outstretched hand revealing a gold ring with the crownstone emblem. "Darius," the man said warmly, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Good to see you. I wasn't expecting you today." Darius returned the handshake, his own smile small but genuine. "David," he replied, his tone familiar. "I thought I'd drop by and take care of a few things." David Hamilton, the CEO of Crownstone Bank, turned to Robert, whose face had gone pale. "Robert," David said, his voice losing none of its warmth but gaining a sharp edge, "is there a problem here?" Robert stammered, his earlier confidence crumbling. I was just ensuring due diligence on a transaction, sir. There were some concerns." David raised an eyebrow, glancing at the check in Robert's hand. He took it, his eyes scanning the details, before he let out a low chuckle. "Concerns? This check is perfectly valid, Robert. In fact," he added, his gaze shifting to Darius, "I'm sure Mr. Morgan could have written it from one of his personal accounts, but I suppose he wanted to keep things simple." The room fell into stunned silence. Robert's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Emily, the young teller, looked as though she wanted to disappear behind her counter. The other employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, their earlier whispers now replaced by shock. David turned back to Darius, his smile returning. "Shall we take care of this in my office? I'd hate for you to be delayed any longer." Darius nodded, his expression calm but with a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "That sounds fine. As the two men walked toward the CEO's office, the silence in the lobby persisted. The weight of the revelation hung heavily in the air, leaving everyone to grapple with what they had just witnessed. Behind them, Robert stood frozen, his mind racing. He had made an assumption, a costly one. And now, he could only watch as the man he had underestimated walked away, his composure unbroken, his authority undeniable. David's office exuded the same aura of wealth and prestige as the rest of the bank, but with an added layer of personal charm. The walls were adorned with tasteful artwork and framed photographs capturing moments of significance, ceremonial ribbon cuttings, charity events, and awards for excellence in banking. A large mahogany desk sat at the center, its polished surface reflecting the soft light from the room's understated chandelier. Behind it, a leather chair sat vacant, its presence commanding even in stillness. Darius followed David inside, his steps deliberate but unhurried. The door closed behind them with a soft click, sealing off the tension still lingering in the lobby. David gestured to a pair of plush chairs facing the desk, and Darius took a seat, placing his briefcase beside him. The CEO moved around the desk, lowering himself into his chair with practiced ease. David leaned back slightly, studying Darius with a look that was equal parts curiosity and admiration. "I have to admit," he began, his tone light but with an edge of sincerity, "you have a way of making an entrance." Darius allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. "Not my intention," he replied, his voice calm. "Though it seems my presence tends to disrupt the usual flow of things." David chuckled, the sound genuine. "That's putting it mildly. I suspect Robert Peterson won't soon forget this day." Darius leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the chair's armrests. "He's not entirely to blame," he said, his tone measured. "The systems in place, both the visible and the unspoken ones, often encourage the kind of behavior we saw today. It's not just about him, it's about the culture he operates within." David nodded, his expression turning thoughtful. "You're not wrong. Crownstone has built a reputation on exclusivity and tradition, but that doesn't mean those traditions are always right." He paused, his gaze sharpening. "But I'll admit, I'm curious. What made you decide to handle this personally today? You could have sent a representative or taken care of this remotely." Darius's gaze drifted briefly to the window, where the bustling streets of downtown Nashville stretched out below. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of reflection. "Sometimes it's important to remind people that appearances can be deceiving. That the assumptions they make, based on skin color, demeanor, or even the way someone walks into a room, are often wrong. I didn't come here to prove a point, but when the opportunity presented itself, I wasn't going to shy away from it." David regarded him silently for a moment, his respect evident. "You're a better man than most, Darius. Many wouldn't have handled the situation with the same grace." Darius met his gaze evenly. "Grace is a choice," he said. "One I've had to make more times than I care to count." The room fell quiet, the weight of Darius's words settling between them. Finally, David broke the silence, his tone lighter but no less sincere. "Well, I'm glad you chose to walk in here today. It's a reminder we all need, myself included." He reached for the check, which lay neatly on his desk. "Let's get this sorted out, shall we? I'll ensure the funds are transferred immediately, and I'll personally see to it that this kind of treatment doesn't happen again, at least, not in my bank." Darius inclined his head slightly. "I appreciate that." David picked up the phone, issuing a series of concise instructions to someone on the other end. His voice carried authority, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Within minutes, the matter was resolved. The check was processed, and the funds transferred seamlessly. When David hung up, he turned back to Darius with a satisfied smile. "That should do it," he said. "Everything is in order." Darius stood, extending a hand. "Thank you, David. Your handling of this speaks volumes." David shook his hand firmly. "The thanks should go to you. For your patience, your understanding, and for reminding us all that we still have a lot to learn." With the transaction complete, Darius retrieved his briefcase and made his way to the door. As he opened it, the muffled sounds of the lobby spilled into the room. The tension had dissipated somewhat, though a subdued buzz of curiosity remained. Employees and customers alike stole glances at him as he emerged, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and respect. Darius walked with the same quiet confidence he had when he entered, but this time, the weight of the moment hung heavier in the air. He paused briefly near the teller counters, his gaze sweeping across the room. Emily, the young teller who had first served him, stood frozen behind her station. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, her lips parted as if to speak. But Darius simply nodded, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. Then he turned and strode toward the exit, the soft chime of the door marking his departure. Outside, the midday sun bathed the city in a golden light. Darius stood on the steps of the bank for a moment, breathing in the crisp winter air. The bustling sounds of the city surrounded him, car horns, distant chatter, the rhythmic clatter of footsteps on the sidewalk. Yet amidst the chaos, Darius felt a profound sense of calm. As he descended the steps, his mind turned to the future. This wasn't the first time he'd faced a situation like this, and it wouldn't be the last. But he knew that each encounter, each moment of resistance, was a chance to shift the narrative. To challenge the assumptions that had persisted for far too long. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, the driver stepping out to open the door for him. Darius climbed in, the door closing with a soft thud. As the car pulled away from the curb, he glanced back at the bank through the tinted window. It stood as a symbol of power and prestige, but also as a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. Darius leaned back in his seat, his expression thoughtful. The road ahead was long, but he was no stranger to the journey. And as the car merged into the flow of traffic, he felt a quiet determination settle within him. This was just one step, a small victory in a much larger battle. But it was a step worth taking. As the car disappeared into the city's labyrinth of streets, the sun continued its slow arc across the sky, casting shadows that stretched and shifted with the passing hours. Inside Crownstone Bank, the echoes of the day's events lingered, leaving behind a story that would be told and retold, a reminder of what it meant to challenge the status quo and demand more, from others and from oneself. As Darius's car wove through the streets of Nashville, the city outside the window transformed into a blur of vibrant energy. The tall glass skyscrapers gave way to historic brick buildings, and eventually, to quieter neighborhoods lined with trees whose bare branches reached skyward like delicate sculptures. Inside the car, the air was still, broken only by the muted hum of the engine. Darius leaned back, his expression calm but introspective, his thoughts drifting back to the events at the bank. His driver, Marcus, a middle-aged man with a quiet demeanor, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "All good at the bank, sir?" he asked, his voice even but tinged with curiosity. Darius turned his gaze to Marcus, offering a faint smile. "It's handled," he replied. "Though it took a bit more effort than it should have." Marcus nodded, his hand steady on the wheel. "These things have a way of showing people's true colors." Darius hummed in agreement, his mind replaying the scene with Robert Peterson. He had encountered men like Robert before, men who wore their authority like armor, who clung to their assumptions as if they were truths etched in stone. Yet, beneath their rigid exteriors often lay insecurity, the fear of losing control over the narratives they had constructed. The car came to a smooth stop at a red light. Darius glanced out the window, his attention drawn to a small coffee shop on the corner. Through the glass, he saw a group of young professionals seated around a table, their animated conversation punctuated by laughter. The sight made him think of the countless times he had sat in similar settings, forging connections and exchanging ideas that would later shape his journey. As the light turned green, the car moved forward, leaving the coffee shop behind. Darius's phone buzzed softly on the seat beside him, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the screen. It was a message from his assistant, Celeste. "Meeting with the board confirmed for tomorrow at 9 a.m. agenda attached. Let me know if there's anything you'd like adjusted." Darius typed a quick reply, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. Thanks, Celeste. The agenda looks fine. Let's ensure the community outreach initiative is given priority. He placed the phone down, his gaze returning to the city outside. The community outreach initiative was one of the many projects close to his heart. It was more than just philanthropy, it was a commitment to leveling the playing field, to creating opportunities for those who had been overlooked or underestimated. Darius knew all too well what it felt like to be dismissed, to have others make assumptions about his worth based on superficial judgments. The car eventually pulled up to a gated estate. The wrought iron gates swung open smoothly, revealing a long driveway flanked by meticulously maintained hedges. At the end of the drive stood a sprawling modern home, its sleek lines and expansive glass walls a testament to contemporary design. The property exuded understated luxury, a reflection of Darius's belief in quality over ostentation. Marcus parked the car and stepped out to open the door for Darius. "Home sweet home," he said with a small smile. "Thanks, Marcus," Darius replied as he stepped out. "I'll see you in the morning." Marcus nodded and climbed back into the car, driving off toward the garage. Darius walked up the stone steps to the front door, which opened automatically as he approached. Inside, the house was as quiet as the car had been, the only sound coming from the soft whir of the climate control system. He placed his briefcase on the marble entryway table and made his way to the living room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the rolling hills in the distance, their slopes tinged with the warm hues of the setting sun. He stood there for a moment, taking in the scene, before sinking into the plush sofa. The events of the day played out in his mind like scenes from a movie. Robert's skepticism, David's intervention, the hushed whispers of the employees, all of it felt like a microcosm of the larger issues Darius had spent his life navigating. It wasn't about the check or even about Robert's assumptions. It was about the systems that allowed such biases to persist, the silent complicity of those who benefited from them, and the courage it took to challenge them. Darius's thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps. He turned to see his wife, Lila, entering the room. Her presence brought a sense of warmth that immediately softened his mood. She was dressed casually, her dark hair pulled back into a loose braid, and her eyes held the quiet strength that had drawn him to her all those years ago. "You're home earlier than I expected," she said, crossing the room to join him. Darius smiled, his expression lightening. "I thought I'd call it a day. It's been eventful." Lila arched an eyebrow as she sat beside him. "Eventful how?" He recounted the events at the bank, his tone even but tinged with dry humor. Lila listened intently, her expression shifting from disbelief to indignation to quiet understanding. "Some people never learn," she said when he finished. "But you handled it the way you always do, with grace and a touch of poetic justice." Darius chuckled. "Poetic justice might be overstating it, but I'll take the compliment." Lila rested a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "You've built something extraordinary, Darius. Not just wealth or success, but a legacy. And every time you face situations like this, you remind people of what truly matters. That's the real victory." Her words resonated deeply, echoing the thoughts he had wrestled with throughout the day. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You always know what to say." "It's one of my many talents," she replied with a teasing smile. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the sun dipping lower on the horizon. As the golden light gave way to the cool hues of twilight, Darius felt a renewed sense of purpose. The day's events had been a reminder of the challenges that remained, but also of the progress that was possible. Lila eventually rose, her hand trailing along his shoulder. "I'll go check on dinner. Don't stay in your thoughts too long, okay?" "I won't," Darius promised, watching as she disappeared into the kitchen. He leaned back, his gaze returning to the view outside. The lights of the city began to twinkle in the distance, a reminder of the lives unfolding in the world beyond his home. Darius knew that his journey was far from over. There were still battles to fight, still systems to challenge, and still lives to uplift. But for now, in this quiet moment, he allowed himself a brief reprieve, a chance to reflect on the road he had traveled and the one that lay ahead. The world would still be there tomorrow, with all its complexities and imperfections. And Darius Morgan would be ready to meet it, one step at a time. The morning sunlight spilled across the sprawling lawns of Darius's estate, painting the dewy grass in hues of gold and emerald. The air was crisp and invigorating, the kind of morning that felt charged with possibility. Inside, the household hummed with quiet activity. The faint clink of dishes from the kitchen mingled with the soft tones of a classical piano piece playing in the background. Darius sat at the dining table, his laptop open in front of him as he reviewed the agenda for the upcoming board meeting. A steaming cup of coffee rested beside him, the rich aroma filling the room. His eyes scanned the document, noting key points and mentally preparing his remarks. The community outreach initiative was at the top of his priorities. Today, he intended to push harder than ever to secure the board's commitment to expanding their efforts. As he worked, Lila entered the room, a mug of tea in hand. She was dressed in a casual yet elegant outfit, her presence as poised as ever. She approached the table, glancing at the screen before meeting his gaze. "Big day?" she asked, her tone warm. Darius nodded. "Board meeting. It's time to get everyone on the same page about the outreach program. There's too much at stake to let it stagnate." Lila smiled, her expression a mix of pride and encouragement. "You've always been good at making people see the bigger picture. I have no doubt you'll convince them." Her confidence in him was a steadying force, and he reached out to give her hand a gentle squeeze. "Thanks, Lila. I'll need every bit of that optimism today." After finishing his coffee, Darius gathered his materials and made his way to the garage, where Marcus was already waiting by the car. The ride to the bank's headquarters was smooth, the morning traffic unusually light. As they approached the towering glass building that housed Crownstone's main offices, Darius felt a familiar blend of focus and determination settle over him. The lobby of the headquarters was as imposing as the building itself, high ceilings, marble floors, and a massive mural depicting the city's growth over the decades. Employees and visitors moved purposefully through the space, their voices echoing faintly in the cavernous room. Darius took the private elevator to the top floor, where the executive offices and boardroom were located. As the doors opened with a soft chime, he was greeted by Celeste, his efficient and ever-reliable assistant. She handed him a neatly organized folder, her expression calm but alert. "Everything's set for the meeting, Mr. Morgan," she said. "The board members are already in the conference room. I've ensured the presentation materials are in place." "Perfect," Darius replied. "Thank you, Celeste. Let's make this count." She gave a small nod before stepping aside to let him pass. Darius entered the boardroom, a spacious and meticulously designed space dominated by a long mahogany table. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while sleek, modern furnishings added to the room's understated elegance. The board members were seated around the table, their expressions ranging from neutral to mildly curious as Darius entered. David Hamilton sat at the head, his presence commanding but approachable. He offered Darius a warm smile as he took his seat. "Good morning, everyone," David began, his tone congenial. "Before we dive into today's agenda, I'd like to acknowledge the work Darius has been doing to drive some of our most critical initiatives. His vision and leadership have been instrumental in shaping the future of this bank." There was a murmur of agreement from some of the board members, though others remained silent, their expressions guarded. Darius wasn't surprised. Change was never easy, and his push for inclusivity and community engagement had met resistance from those who viewed such efforts as distractions from profitability. When it was his turn to speak, Darius stood, his posture confident but not imposing. He began his presentation, outlining the details of the community outreach initiative with precision and clarity. He spoke of the economic and social impact it would have, not just for underserved communities, but for the bank's reputation as a forward-thinking institution. His words were measured but passionate, underscoring the importance of aligning business success with social responsibility. As he spoke, he observed the board members carefully. Some nodded in agreement, their expressions thoughtful. Others appeared skeptical, their body language revealing their reluctance to embrace his vision. One member, an older man named Charles Alden, leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "This is all very admirable, Darius," Charles said when the presentation ended. "But let's not forget our primary responsibility, to our shareholders. Projects like these, while well-intentioned, often fail to deliver tangible returns. We can't afford to lose sight of our bottom line." The tension in the room was palpable, but Darius remained composed. He met Charles's gaze directly, his tone firm but respectful. "I understand your concerns, Charles. But I believe we're looking at this too narrowly. The world is changing, and businesses that adapt to those changes are the ones that thrive. Customers and investors alike are placing more value on companies that demonstrate a commitment to social impact. This isn't just about doing what's right, it's about staying relevant in an evolving market." David spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension. "Darius has a point. The data supports the idea that businesses with strong social initiatives perform better in the long run. And let's not forget, we have a responsibility to the communities we serve. Ignoring that could cost us more than any short-term investment ever could." The discussion that followed was lively, with opinions flying back and forth. Darius listened carefully, addressing concerns and counterarguments with facts and insights. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere began to shift. The skepticism in the room gave way to a tentative curiosity, and by the time the meeting concluded, a majority of the board had expressed their support for the initiative. As the members filed out, David approached Darius, a satisfied smile on his face. "Well done," he said. "You've managed to turn some of our most stubborn skeptics into believers. That's no small feat." Darius allowed himself a small smile. "It's a step in the right direction. But there's still a lot of work to be done." David nodded. "That's true. But if anyone can do it, it's you." After the meeting, Darius returned to his office, a spacious but understated space that reflected his personality. He sat at his desk, his thoughts a mixture of relief and determination. The board's approval was a victory, but it was only the beginning. Implementing the initiative and ensuring its success would require persistence, creativity, and, most importantly, trust. As he looked out the window at the city below, Darius felt a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges he had faced, both in and out of the boardroom, had shaped him into the man he was today. And while the path ahead was far from easy, he knew it was one worth traveling. For Darius Morgan, success had never been about wealth or recognition. It was about making a difference, about challenging the status quo and creating opportunities where none had existed before. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the city in a warm, golden glow, he made a silent promise to himself, to continue the fight, to push for progress, and to leave a legacy that would outlast him.